4th of July, everybody. It's 2012, and that is the date today. And continuing with our 4th of July extravaganza, here we have Terry Phillips, who's running for the U.S. House of Representatives. I guess you must have been redistricted, but it's district number 23. And California has the top two primaries, so everyone's in the primaries, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Green, Libertarian, Independent, etc. And whoever is the top two gets to go to the primary. So you could have two Republicans, two Democrats, two Independents, two third-party candidates, and he made it. It's going to be him and one other person, Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican. So, Terry, thank you very much for spending part of your 4th of July here today, and I do appreciate your time. Just for full disclosure, we kind of tried to do an interview yesterday. My recording equipment was all bad, so we're just starting from scratch here today and just going with, we're not reading off teleprompters here. And so, Terry, good to talk to you today, and happy 4th of July. And the question I usually start off with is what drives you, what motivates you, and I know why I'm interviewing you here today. LibertarianProgressive.com. We're interviewing independent third-party candidates, so the voters know more of their choices and more of their options and can be more fully informed. So why am I interviewing you? Because you're running, and why are you running, sir?
Well, Thomas, first I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and I'm running because I believe that in a democracy people deserve a choice, and when there's only one candidate on the ballot, I don't think that's very democratic. Having been a journalist for most of my professional life, I have worked in a lot of places around the world where people were struggling and sacrificing in order to have the right to choose among candidates. And I came back home to the Central Valley of California and found that that choice didn't really exist. So the very first reason I threw my hat into the ring was because I thought we had an obligation to give voters a choice. And then once I looked at the existing choice, I found that he and I had a lot of differences, so I'm now running to offer people not just a choice, but a better choice.
Well, you're, really in it. You're going to be on the ballot. The voters they'll have two choices, part of the establishment, Republicrats or Democrats, and then you as an independent. Now, you are an independent, not a part of a third party. Is that correct?
That's correct. And for most of my professional life, I have not been affiliated with a political party. I didn't think it was appropriate for someone covering politics, as I have done, to be publicly associated with any party. And not because there's anything wrong with parties. I just think it's better for journalists to remain as, neutral is the best word I can think of. There's no such thing as objectivity, but to be as removed from the process as possible, not to have a horse in the race.
Yes, sir. That made me think of something. Do you remember when the last time a journalist was an elective representative or Senate in the Congress, sir?
That's a great question. I need to find the answer to that. I don't know, but I will look it up. I think that's a terrific question.
If it's a good journalist, they're going to ask the tough questions, and maybe that's it's supposed to be the fourth, part of the branch of government, kind of not officially, but that's why we have freedom of the press, and we're all the press, I suppose here.
I can think of two offhand. They're both Democrats. Al Gore was a journalist, and John F. Kennedy was a journalist.
Okay, all right. Well, Al Gore, he was, kind of. Yeah.
But I would be surprised if there wasn't somebody else who's been in the House and maybe also in the Senate.
Probably.
But I'll try to find out. That's a great question.
Yeah. Well, now that's pretty good, sir. Pretty good answers. It's pretty impressive. I think I could just imagine a hard-hitting journalist asking all the right questions, going, when you're investigating different things in committees, just trying to get to the bottom of the story, having so the public can know what's going on with their elected representatives. And let's just get to some issues here because, that should be what it's about. So, we're not electing you because, you have a good telephone voice or because, you have a nice haircut or anything like that, right? It's now the civil liberties. I'm going to bring that up first. Do you believe that we're innocent. I mean, as the Constitution states, that we're innocent until proven guilty, that we should not experience searches and seizures of our property, personal records, and persons requiring an independent judge's approval under oath. No illegal searches and seizures where people can write their own warrants, and you can't even tell about it without being in contempt of court. The right to a competent counsel, no cruel and unusual punishments, basically due process. Are those things that principles and that you would recognize as part of the law?
These are all so fundamental to our way of life, our system of government. The Bill of Rights, is the ones you've described, the elements of our Bill of Rights, are things that every school child should know. It shouldn't be possible to graduate from high school, let alone college, without knowing these things. And there are people, of course, around the world who also believe in these principles, but it is fundamental to our system of government.
Yeah, and I also forgot to add in there a right to a fair trial, a speedy trial, having a jury of your peers, and knowing the evidence against you, your accusers, being able to talk to a lawyer. I did mention that.
Right. The rights of free expression, freedom of press, of speech, of religion, all of the things that make us free.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's the most important thing. Why is that important? I mean, if we beat all the terrorists and if we have prosperity, but we don't have those things that I just mentioned, then what is the use of any of that?
I think it was Justice Blackstone. I'm reaching way back here in history, but I think it was Justice Blackstone who said that without due process, nothing else in our system of government is possible. It is the ultimate safeguard against tyranny.
It's lawlessness, and that's what tyranny really is lawlessness.
Right.
And I just wanted to start off with that because if it's, and I know the word litmus test has been thrown around for like Supreme Court candidates, and if to me, if there ever was a litmus test, and it's a real low one, I mean, you have to at least be breathing and alive, right? But here's another low one. You got to recognize habeas corpus, which is basically knowing the charges against you and having due process. And I think that was originally manuscripted in the Magna Carta and has expanded and evolved to our U.S. Constitution. And it's basically a renaissance in law, that and a few other things. The National Defense Authorization Act, which was voted on in December last year, I think December 31st, the very last day of Congress, last day of the year, and right before everyone was probably going to their New Year's party, that there are people, not everybody, but certain people who voted for the ability for the government to indefinitely, I mean, I guess forever, detain somebody. No one would ever know. And not only that, on U.S. soil by our U.S. military getting rid of posse comitatus, and you don't know who's accusing you of these charges. You don't know what the evidence is for these charges. It's really Stalin-esque. It kind of, I mean, if there ever was a litmus test, but that's what our elected representatives, pass through Congress, and is that, any way to, not to sound cheesy here, to celebrate the 4th of July? And that's what your opponent, Kevin, I think Kevin McCarthy, he voted for the National Defense Authorization.
He did indeed. I was meeting with a group of veterans this morning at our local war memorial here in Bakersfield, and these are guys who have been through the worst of it. One guy was a World War II vet, another just came back from Afghanistan, and they've seen the spectrum among living vets. They've seen almost every phase of what the military does, and they expressed shock and dismay to me by the way politicians are treating them. They send them out to do the job, and then they come back home and, well, thanks, guys, but good luck getting health care, good luck getting housing, good luck getting a job.
And maybe that's what happens when we have low voter turnout. I mean, the average is under 50%, even though, and it's mostly Republicans and Democrats. I mean, it's the buck stops somewhere, and it's the people who introduce and pass the laws. And the largest majority of constituency that's either belonging to a party or not affiliated, or people who are not affiliated to any party, who are independents. So that way I won't have to go to a Republican candidate websites and usually see their talking points, and vice versa with the Democrats who've been promising the same promises since the Kennedy and Nixon debates. Now, a big issue that kind of somewhat separates the Republicans and the Democrats, however, not so much as of lately, is the budgets. I mean, it's funny, whenever the Republicans get in, they're the ones who increase the budget, and whenever it's the Democrats, they take away more civil rights. I mean, we're always getting the opposites. I mean, I'm just starting to wonder how many people are noticing that, observing these patterns, so what do you think about, there's taxes and there's cutting spending, and then there's investments and other things. How would you tackle the budget, sir?
I think we're asking the wrong question. We're looking at this from the wrong end of the telescope. People begin by asking how we should conduct taxation, what programs we should cut, or how much money we should raise to run the government. But we don't ask the much more fundamental questions. How much service do we need, and how much service do we want? And then once we answer that question, then we can figure out how we're going to pay for those things. But if you start out by saying how much money do we want to give the government to spend, well, there's never an end to it. And unfortunately, the very people who are supposed to be responsible for our money, the national resources, are the ones who are most benefiting from it directly. And whether it's to conduct a political campaign or to help their friends get more wealthy than they already are, it seems like we're the last ones to come to the table and to get those services. And particularly when it comes to things that will make it possible for our children and grandchildren to have any kind of quality of life. We're not investing in education. We're not investing in infrastructure. Defense is important, but we don't even know how much money is being spent on our behalf.
We have no idea. But
even veterans are not happy about this. You'd think that they would say, well, yeah, let's just write a blank check. They're not saying that. They want the money to be spent wisely.
Well, the veterans, the biggest turnout for the veterans as far as contributions go this year, and even 4 years ago, was to Ron Paul. Like him or not, he did advocate a policy against, and he's a Republican that from Texas that advocated and who was also in the military, advocating a policy of trade and friendship, and basically cutting the military budgets a lot, keeping a strong defense, and guess he got more campaign contributions than all the other candidates combined from our armed services. It
does concern me that so many people in government today have absolutely no military experience, no exposure to combat. They vote on things and they don't really know what they're talking about half the time.
I mean, how many tours have some of these people been on? Like 8, 7, 6?
The worst cases of what we started to call post-traumatic stress disorder during the Vietnam era, at that time, guys were doing maybe 2, at the most 3 tours. But now you're right. It seems like there's no end to it. And then they come back with all sorts of horrible mental illnesses, and there's an extremely high suicide rate. I think it's something like 18 vets a day
I
are
think
taking
I've
their
read
own
that
lives.
it's the second leading cause of death.
What are we doing? We're not taking proper care of the people whose lives are put at risk to safeguard our own. This is just not right. And unfortunately, my opponent is doing nothing to help veterans. Nothing at all.
I mean, this is a voluntary military. You can make that argument, but still, even so, this is very, very, it's... There's a Marine general from years ago called Smedley Butler who warned us about, he kind of lived right around the World War II era, that all the military adventures and operations that he took in South America and all these places were done for corporations, basically. I mean, he called war a racket.
Yeah, well, sadly, we have conflated these two ideas of national security and the military-industrial complex. And just because we spend a lot of money on the military does not necessarily mean that we are any safer. We need to be much smarter about the way we choose which weapons programs to pay for and what equipment to send to our troops. It has to be done in a rational way. We have to stop planning for yesterday's wars. But again, you have people in Congress and in the White House who haven't served, haven't seen combat firsthand for the most part, and are supposed to be making choices on our behalf. Well, how do they have the judgment to do that if they don't have the experience?
And so going back to what you're saying, what should be our goal? Like you said, instead of worrying about exactly the numbers per se, I mean, of course you would, but what should be our goal of our military? What should they be doing now? Should we start World War III in the Middle East?
Well, generals are said to be the most reluctant to begin wars because they know how bad it is. And of course we shouldn't be starting unnecessary wars. Sometimes a country is faced with an existential threat and it has to protect itself. That's of course the first obligation of our armed forces. They have to be strong, they have to be well equipped, well trained. None of those things is in question. But how far do we go? How do we design the mission? What goals do we set? Are they achievable goals? We ask our people to do amazing things, and they are astonishing in what they have been able to accomplish.
Like Patton said, his job is to do the impossible.
Right. But every now and then we should ask them to limit what they do to the possible and to the necessary. I know it's a terrible job when you have to engage in these kinds of life and death struggles, and they do it for the sake of the country. We shouldn't ask them to do it for unnecessary reasons. That's what I object to.
Yeah.
And by the way, having been in both Iraq and Afghanistan long before these conflicts began, I can tell you that neither one was necessary. I know this directly, and the vets I talked to coming back from there, nobody wants to be told that their loved one died in vain, but they understand that a lot of the losses in these conflicts were absolutely unnecessary.
Oh yeah, we could have done the containment for Iraq still. I mean, Paul O'Neill, President W. Bush's, he was the economic guy. I forgot the name of it, but the Secretary of the Treasury, actually, he was. He was on I think it was a 2020 interview, and I don't know if you remember Paul O'Neill, but said they were drawing up plans to divvy up Iraq before even September the 11th, and so that's what he said on a major interview, and that's Bush's own Treasury Secretary who was privy to all the meetings. And actually, after 9/11, we passed the Patriot Act, but perhaps maybe if we listen to some of the CIA agents, which this has been on the news lately, who are trying to warn us about certain anomalies and suspicious activity, which we didn't. I wish there was a way where we could promote people like that, and that guy that was in the FBI who died in the World Trade Center building. I don't know if you remember that story, but he's the guy who was trying to warn the FBI, and then they he got rid of his job. I don't know if he got fired or quit, but then he became security director of the World Trade Centers and then died soon thereafter. And no one would listen to him. I mean, he was ignored. So instead of being too scared to be called unpatriotic because you passed the Unpatriotic Act, there's sensible things that we could have done, and that would be listen to some of the people on the floor that are out there. And gathering this information and gathering this intelligence, and just the cockpit doors. I mean, it took us years before we even implemented those, but instead we decided to just to get to one tree in the forest, just burn the whole forest down. I mean, and we talked yesterday about the Patriot Act. I mean, again, that's what do you think about the Patriot Act, sir?
Well, the word I use is abomination. It's an abomination. There is just no justification for sacrificing all of those rights, all of those elements from our Bill of Rights for the sake of addressing fear. Yes, I know people were scared after September 11th, and it was a wake-up call. But you don't fight a threat like that by giving up all of your rights. It's exactly the opposite reaction. We are turning into our adversary, our own worst adversary. Look, I was in the Soviet Union and reported its collapse 20 years ago. We are in some ways turning into the Soviet Union. We're restricting people's civil rights. We're controlling press. We're trying to put everything under this huge security umbrella. And yes, of course, we have to be more careful about our national secrets, and we need to safeguard important sites. But it doesn't mean that we have to give up the rights, the protections offered by the Fourth Amendment. We should remain safe in our papers and our possessions. That should not have been permitted. Unfortunately, the people who made those choices, A, didn't really have time to read the bill.
That wasn't the cause of why 9/11 happened.
No, of course not. Of course not. And B, they didn't understand that by allowing this change in our laws, that it actually makes us less safe. It certainly makes us less free, and that's what I object to.
Yeah, it's true. And so it's the Supreme Court luckily has judged against some of the provisions that were in the Patriot Act, but and luckily there's some of them were put to a sunset law, but
right.
I mean, this was a bill that was floating around Congress for years before 9/11, and no one in their right mind, well, not the majority at least, would have ever voted for it. That's why it never passed. So they introduced this bill that was thousands of pages long, and gave you about a day or two to read it and then vote on it. And if you didn't, hence the title, the Patriot Act. And then after that, we had the bank bailouts, and then of course we passed Medicare, and we went into Iraq, and there's lots of abuses that happened with the private mercenaries that we hire and pay about 10 times as much as our soldiers. One thing that's I like that you're an independent here is because a lot of people like to call what happened to our economy and blame it on capitalism, or some people do. Most people might not, but enough of people do. And at the same time, people like to call the Obama health care thing, the Affordable Health Care Act, or and call that socialism, which it's not socialism. I mean, but everyone's framing the whole debate wrong. I mean, they both are fascism, which is the merging of corporation and states. And we have separation of church and state, or you can look at the word instead of the definition. But if you reframe that question as a definition, that we have the separation of a big organization that has been known to use its power and abuse it and deny people their civil rights. And so, I think the main thing is the separation of corporation and state. Maybe we wouldn't have bailed them all out. Maybe some of these small and mid-sized businesses might have been able to purchase those big companies that were too big to fail, and they would be under much better management, except we kept all the same managers, and they got to keep bonuses. And then the same thing with the insurance, the Obamacare. A lot of insurance companies are celebrating and opening the champagne bottles right now.
Yeah, and Thomas, being a journalist, in some ways I'm probably a politician's worst nightmare, because if elected, I'm going to spend much of my time telling the truth about what goes on in Congress, in the House, and even in the Senate. They don't want too many of their secrets to be revealed. You'll probably remember that some months ago, my old shops, CBS, broke the story about the insider trading, the legal insider trading that was going on inside the halls of Congress, and they finally passed some kind of fig leaf legislation to stop that. I'm sure that some people will find a way of getting around that, but people in power don't like their dirty little secrets revealed. Well, it's our House. It's our legislation. They're supposed to be working for us. And maybe it is time to have a full-time journalist working for us in Congress, and that's something that I would happily do.
That sounds like an excellent idea. I can picture that. Um, now, what about the Middle East, though? It's the Middle East is in the news. You know, there's wars and rumors of wars. I mean, we're dealing with Syria, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Iran, Palestine, Pakistan, Afghanistan. I mean, Turkey. What's you know, maybe people could trade instead of have war and have some competition and do what we do with China? Do you think that's even possible, or you think the hatreds are just so steeped in that that there's no other solution except war, or just to just get out of there?
I was in Bosnia during the height of that conflict, and one villager jokingly said to me that they continued to trade even when combat was going on. He said, we would sell bullets to them and they would shoot them back at us. But the fact is, trade is, of course, a better solution than armed conflict. And while there is always going to be some conflict in the world, I think we would be far better served by having representatives who were interested in ending conflict rather than starting them or perpetuating them. The Middle East is a tricky place. I've spent a fair amount of time there. I have family ties to there. All four of my grandparents were born in Turkey. They were of Greek and Armenian origin. And I know that that's a difficult part of the world for people to try to get along. But it's possible. If only they aren't provoked to go to war all the time. And I think we can help by minimizing the sale of arms. And that's, of course, one of our biggest industries. We're really good at making and selling weapon systems.
Yeah, should we not sell the same weapons that could be used against us
Exactly,
later on?
Exactly. When I was in Afghanistan, after the Mujahideen took over Kabul, there was a news conference, and we asked the people in charge whether they had plans to return the American-made Stinger missiles. And the guy said, well, yeah, for the right price. You know, I mean, that's how they look at this. It's just a big bazaar. It's a big marketplace. We should stop promoting conflict in the world.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that's why we are there, so once we have a puppet government, then we'll be able to trade, but that's not really real trade. I mean, that's the real trade, I mean, is like we trade with Vietnam now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
we could have saved ourselves a lot of grief and a lot of death by going straight to trade instead of going through this middle ground of war.
Yeah, maybe someday they'll have a McDonald's there or not. Maybe not go. They might not go that far, but you never know. So that takes us to food, though. Actually, being in California, and I don't know if your district really considers this a big issue or not, but I know it's gotten some national attention. Is whether we're able to know if the foods that we eat have been genetically modified. Now this is about labeling. It's not about restricting anyone from purchasing genetically modified foods. It just means that if I bought a box of macaroni and cheese, I would know that the macaroni or whatever would have been made from genetically modified wheats or whatever it's made out of.
There's an effort right now to put that on the November ballot, I believe it is, an initiative to require that kind of labeling. And of course, being in the Central Valley of California, agriculture is of extreme importance to us here. I don't think there's anything wrong with letting people know what's in the food that they buy and that they consume, as long as it's not so onerous, as long as the regulations don't do more harm than good. But I'm all for as much free exchange of information as we can muster.
I mean, if we can't have that, then maybe we shouldn't let candy bars list that this was made in a factory that had peanuts and stuff.
I think it's equally important for us to teach kids what those labels mean. I think a lot of folks see the labels and ignore them because they don't understand them. I think that the very least we need to do is teach school children how to read those labels and to understand the importance of the various kinds of nutritional information that's on those labels.
I see companies trying to patent these different genes, especially when a lot of that R&D was done with public money, and now they want to restrict it. That they're their seeds might populate with the natural environments, and then when it does, then they find out that their variant of corn has gone into a farmer's land that also is growing corn, but didn't use their specific, didn't get their permission to use that. They're suing
Right.
them. I mean, if they have the right to patent it and change it, the name, it's could be argued that it's really no longer what it originally was. I mean, if I had a tomato with fish genes, which for a while there, they were making tomatoes with fish genes, and they're making cats that glow in the dark and things like that around the world.
I'm kind of old school. I like the tomatoes that I grow in my backyard. I also think it's a national security matter. We should be growing our own food. We shouldn't reach the point where we're importing everything from around the world. Trade's a great thing, but we need to be self-reliant too.
I mean, here's another one: is should we have to go to our doctor to get a prescription to have multivitamins?
There are so many of these complex questions that unfortunately get glossed over, and instead people talk about a lot of social issues, and I understand that people have strong feelings about their different belief systems, but we need to survive here. We need to get past the point where we're importing goods that are killing our children. That's a much more serious problem, in my opinion, than whether someone feels that a particular kind of...
You mean like toys and stuff with lead
Well,
in it?
toys, sure, yeah, but we ought to be more concerned about not killing our kids with high levels of lead in the toys that we import, rather than whether adults can make decisions about what they eat or smoke or drink.
Yeah, I totally agree. We need to get them like quickly off trying to make plans about that and focus on other things. Kind of lead the dog back onto the sidewalk or something like that, and say we have other issues besides trying to prevent vitamins from being able to be marketed. Now, you are kind of in a Republican district, so are you going to introduce or support any legislation that would restrict gun rights? Or do you think what we have right now is pretty?
I think the Second Amendment is just fine. I think we need to evolve with the times. Our laws need to evolve with the times. But anyone who thinks that Americans aren't capable of making choices about how to defend themselves or what weapons they want to use for sport or to collect, I think these are all reasonable things to do. It's not new. I think we need to get over our irrational fear of firearms. In a lot of places, of course, there's still a lot of gun violence, but there's a lot of violence. I think it would be much better if we concentrated on the fundamental problem rather than try to take away the way people express those problems.
Well, usually the problem is, hopelessness and poverty.
Sure.
And so that would be the correct way to deal with that. And it's the same thing kind of in the abortion debate. Let's just try to prevent more of those instead of, that would be more of the root of the problem. That's going to cause a bigger impact.
I hear people saying that they are that they don't support, quote, pro-abortion laws. I don't know anyone who is pro-abortion. I know women who have terminated their pregnancies. They're not pro-abortion. They just want to have control over their own reproductive systems. I don't think that's any of the government's business. We ought to leave people alone.
Yeah,
let those decisions be made between a woman and her doctor, or between a man and his doctor for his health.
Yeah, and what if it's the life of the mother and rape and incest and things like that? I mean, a lot of people don't even...
This is not the government's business. We should stop meddling in people's private lives.
Now, one thing is, though, considering that, and I think a lot of people could agree with that, do you think we should ever use federal taxpayer dollars for abortions? Do you think that would be a good compromise between the two parties?
Here's what I think about all that. We have a lot of public services or a lot of government expenses that are paid for with tax money, right? In fact, almost all of it, almost everything the government spends is paid for with taxes. You and I might not agree with many of those services that the government provides, and yet our tax money pays for those things. Well, I think we need to get over the notion that we can pick and choose what the government spends its money on. We get to vote. We get to vote for people who vote on our behalf, and we want them to make the best choices on our behalf. But we don't get to make every single call. And if I'm offended by something that the government is spending money on that you want, that's my problem. But if a majority of people say, let's have this, then that's what we're going to have. We should not allow any special interest, let alone any individual, to have the final say. This is still a democracy. Yes, I know people argue, is it a republic or is it a democracy? Well, it's both. A republic is a form of democracy.
Elected republic.
Exactly. And that's the way it works, that we vote, we vote for representatives who vote on our behalf, and we're not always happy with the results. And then we have elections, and if we're unhappy, if enough of us are unhappy, then we vote for someone new.
Well,
which
I
is
can
what I'm
understand
hoping
the
will
argument
happen.
because some people have like a really strong belief that they're going to, go to hell and stuff if they don't, if
Sure.
there's federal taxes going to it. But at the same time, you can make just as strong an argument about people who are anti-war, that their tax dollars are going to, just gunning down millions of people and killing them with napalm and depleted uranium and all kinds of things.
And what we have to remember is that it's a process. We are, as a species and as a country, as a culture, we are always changing. I hope generally we are changing for the better. There are things that we did 100 years ago that we would never think of doing today. Yeah. People, the easy example is slavery. I don't know of a living person in America today who thinks we ought to dial back the clock to the early 19th century. Of course not. No one would make that argument. But in the middle 1800s, there was no question but that there would be some slavery.
Right, but
until we fought a war over
against it. Like I would say, living in the time you're in, personally, is no excuse. Because there were people.
But the only point I'm making, Thomas, is that we change. Our country today is different than it was
I hear your point.
A century or 2 centuries ago. And I believe that a century or 2 centuries from now, people will look back on this time and they will say, really? That's what they were doing back then?
People used to have what were those showdowns or whatever to stop?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've done a lot of things in our past that we would not think of doing today. And politics is a difficult process because it is in the moment. We're making political decisions today that will have long-term effects. And it's impossible for us to know. At least I don't know of anybody who has a crystal ball who can tell me how the country's going to look in a century or two. I hope it'll still be here, and I hope it'll be better. I believe it will be better. That's what we do. We get better. We have to stop treating each other as the enemy just because we disagree. We'll figure it out. But my complaint with Congress today, if I may bring it back to this, is that we have a bunch of people who are actively engaged in preventing the country from progressing. They are anti-progressive, and I don't just mean that in the political, philosophical sense. I mean actually. They're trying to stop us from getting to the next step in the process.
Yeah, and maybe that's why they've gone down in single digits in the Gallup poll ratings earlier this year about the approval ratings for Congress.
Worst in the history of the United States.
Worst
ever.
History. And the media reporting them is not too much better, and hopefully that can go up.
True. True enough.
As well. And that's a sad state of affairs, and that really is the State of the Union. So this should be the a prime time, like the season should be ripe for people to get in there. I mean, there's 50 states, obviously, and some other territories, and I mean, if we could get just one House, and some states none, and some states a little bit more, but maybe average at least one representative from each state into the House and crash the party, occupy the House of Representatives, be in a lawful way, support legislators who have our best interests in mind, who are going to, read the bill, not pass things like the NDAA, which, from what I'm hearing, you definitely would have voted the way it was. Probably would have voted against that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. No question.
Yeah, there's, that happened. I mean, that hopefully might wake some people up. I mean, it's hard to believe that 9/11 was ready 10 years ago. I mean, the time is going by quick. It wasn't probably about 40 years ago, you know, with the JFK assassination, and the way we started this 21st century. It's just financially bad decisions, bad foreign policy. I mean, we need to turn this around, and we can turn it around. We need to reclaim what is ours, and that's we the people. And now, healthcare, since the Obama care or the Romney care, whatever you want to call it, did pass. Is there any healthcare legislation that you might want to discuss among and try to build coalitions to try to pass certain changes to it and to make it a lot better?
Well, again, I think we have to begin by deciding what we want. And I believe one of the things, what we want and what we need, and I believe one of the things we need is to address the economics of healthcare. Just a couple of quick facts here. We spend more, the United States spends more on healthcare per capita than any other country on earth. Somewhere in the neighborhood of $7,500 for every man, woman, and child every year on healthcare. The next closest country, I think, is Canada, and they spend about half of what we spend. And all of the other industrialized countries in the world get better results than we do. Everyone in those other countries has access to basic health care. That's not true here. Even after this Health Care Reform Act was passed, there were still more than 10 million Americans without access to basic health care. This is not just an embarrassment. This is a national tragedy. This is a national emergency. We cannot have more than 10 million people in America, legal citizens and residents of the United States, without access to basic health care. This is out of the question.
Yeah, it's mostly going to affect like small business owners and people like that that still won't have it. I mean, you have to make below the poverty or at the poverty line, or if you're too far above it, then
yeah, we're talking about people who are either too poor to afford them to buy their own insurance, or too rich to afford to qualify for government assistance.
So they get stuck in that like kind of level there. Yeah.
And so we have all of these people without basic health care. It is eating up, and I think that's the best term for it. Health care costs are eating up about 20% of our total GDP. The money that this country produces, $1 in every $5 goes into health care. And it's not even the best health care. We love to brag about ourselves. We're number one at this and we're number one at that. Fine. I'm proud to be an American. We are number one at a lot of things. We're not number one in access to basic health care. People are dying in this country, or they're very ill in this country, because they don't have the basics that people in most of the rest of the civilized world have.
So what about a mandate? I mean, I think the only other country that has a mandate is Switzerland's, but or maybe it was Sweden. That we, you would need to purchase from one of these private insurance companies, and not even give you an option for a public option.
And that to me is silly. If this country is about nothing else, this country has to be about choice. We're a country that's all about liberty. I want to be able to choose what health care I get, what health care I pay for. What I don't get to do is put everyone else at risk because, well, I'm not sick. I'm not going to get sick. Why do I have to be involved in the process? How is that different than me wanting to say, well, my house isn't going to catch fire. Why should I pay taxes to pay for the fire department? Or there's nobody who's going to break into my house. Why do I need to help pay for the police department? Well, folks, the only way we can afford public services is if we all pay a little bit. It's just pure greed and ignorance for people to say, I don't want to. I don't want to pay for health care. Well, okay, fine. Live somewhere else, because the rest of us want to pay for health care. If you look at most of the polling that's been done on this subject, the vast majority of Americans want some kind of access to basic health care. Now, the way we get to that, we argue about like cats and dogs. That's okay. We can keep arguing about it. But we can't argue about our commitment as a country to do the right thing, to protect those who are least able to care for themselves, and to do the bare minimum that most of the rest of the world has already figured out how to do. What's wrong with us? How come you and I don't get the same basic health care plans that the people who are representing us in Congress get?
Well, there you go.
What makes them so special?
That's an excellent point. Yeah, that's a good point. That should be one of the options that we have too. Is exactly what our representatives have.
I mean, fine, if they want to live without health care, and they want the rest of us to live without health care, I could understand that. But I don't think they're going to go for that plan.
Right. No, I understand, and that really makes a point. It's kind of like there was this congressperson who was going to reintroduce the draft, and I don't think he really wanted it reintroduced. I think he was more so making the point that either everyone participates in this, or maybe we shouldn't be doing this in the first place. It's a lot easier.
I do like the idea of some kind of national service, by the way. I think everybody ought to contribute something to the well-being of the country. Not necessarily a military draft, although I don't think it's a bad idea for everybody to go through basic training. There's nothing wrong with knowing how to do that, knowing basic survival skills. We had something that was created during the Great Depression called the California Conservation Corps out here, and it taught people basic things about forestry, how to things that scouts learn, and to give back to the country, to do the things that we would expect to do in our family. You're going to eat, fine, somebody has to wash the dishes, somebody has to dry. Just do a little something to give back. I don't care how little money you earn. I don't care how poor your education is. Just do something. Earn your citizenship.
Yeah, I can understand what you're saying. I mean, it probably would be good for a lot of people to go through basic training. But now I would have to say that forcing people to do something and not doing it voluntarily, but we should all chip in. I mean, voluntarily because we want to. There's lots of ways it ought to become
part of our culture. It ought to be something we want to do. We shouldn't have to be coerced into doing it.
Right. Should be part of the culture.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what we're doing today, and participating in politics, and also kind of like what you're saying before, people, if we're going to have public schools, we should have more civics classes.
Right.
And
by the way, my opponent is trying to cut back funds on civics classes. I just don't understand this. Someone who claims to be a public servant, but who doesn't want to teach public service? I don't get that. I also don't get this rabid opposition to government by people who are in government. Government's not a bad thing. Government is one of the most noble institutions we have. It's we the people. It's us getting together.
Well, this type of government is, yes.
It's been corrupted. It's been hijacked.
Right.
But the notion of government, this is why we're having this conversation, Thomas. We believe in government.
Well, it's kind of like what people say about the gun rights thing. It's not guns that kill people, it's the people that do. And it's the same thing with government. It's not the government that does it per se, it's the people in control of it.
People love Ronald Reagan, and he was terrific in so many ways. And he had a great story about I think he said the 9 most dangerous words. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. Well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, nobody ever called him on it. But I'm sorry, that's not a bad thing. We get help from people from government all the time, beginning with teachers and firefighters and cops, and this is all government.
Those are all good things. So the part that's so we need to separate, per se, the wheat from the chaff. I mean, the parts that we could do away with is maybe the DEA, the private prisons, the 3 strikes and you're out, laws, trying to incarcerate more people. We have the highest percentage per capita of people inside a prison than
we have the
Russia,
highest
China,
number,
than any
not
country
just
in the
per capita.
world.
We have the highest actual number of people locked up in America, more than China, a country with 3 times our population or 4 times our population.
Like 1 billion people or something.
We have more people locked up than the Chinese do. What's wrong with this picture?
Is it because we're worse than other people, do you think?
Part of the problem is we're locking people up for being addicted to drugs.
Yeah.
I don't get that. That's a health problem. That's not a crime problem.
Right, and don't you think, sending someone, now if they committed other crimes, of course,
okay, fine,
I don't mean to be a dead horse, but
sure.
They would go in there, but if they only did just drugs, which actually the majority of people who are in there is drug related, I think about 60%, it's, for them to go behind bars and prison, they're probably, some of them might come out better, sure,
but the prison system is a very a profitable business in America. We have plenty of private prisons right here in my district. Well, that's not a good enough reason to make locking people up public policy. We need to discourage people from being locked up, not making it easier for people to get incarcerated.
Yeah, it's
and that begins with education.
The thing with being in a private prison too, I suppose, is that they have a lot of. It's also taking a lot of jobs because a lot of companies will hire these private prisoners and have them work for like pennies on the dollar, and to make their products or take calls for different companies.
And I understand the prison system is also a big employer, and so there's this balance that you have to strike. We've got a bad enough unemployment problem as it is. Do we want to put more people on the street?
Could we just have them do different things, like maybe?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, like pay them the same, but just instead of that, maybe build solar panels or pick up trash or just anything that's different than all this violent things.
There is no shortage of work to be done. What there is a shortage of is a commitment by people in government to help us get over this hump. We are stuck in a similar position to the one our country was in 1930. We just don't call it the Great Depression, but it is. We have somewhere along the lines of a third of the population who are either unemployed or underemployed.
Yeah.
People working 2 or 3 jobs. People not earning enough money to feed their families. It doesn't look the same. We don't have people selling, apples or pencils on the street. But we've hidden our unemployment. It's not that there isn't massive unemployment. And in some communities, there's actually about a third of the population, and in fact, in other communities, even closer to half the population, who are jobless. And yes, you average it out across the country and you play with the numbers and nobody really knows anymore. But it is a massive problem. And if we don't fix this, I don't care what else the government does, how they tinker with the interest rates or whatever else they do, it's not going to solve our economic problems. We need to put people back to work.
And what are the 3 biggest expenses that people have? Well, healthcare is one. That causes a lot of bankruptcies. Housing, utilities, and food. That would have to be people's 3 biggest expenses. If there's a way to, because we have evolved a long way, and I think the 60s kind of was corporate America. That's when you had the Zeniths and the GMs, and they all sprouted up, and if you work for this company long enough, you'll get a retirement, and basically, this, it's kind of like the company will take care of you. Of course, there were a lot of small businesses as well, but I mean, we might be expanding beyond that. There might be a whole new paradigm, and I think would be good to, I'm not saying you have any specific policy suggestions on this right yet, but I mean, looking for a way to also reduce people's expenses. So, instead of just finding jobs, I mean, if people would have some rights so their lands couldn't be taken away under certain situations.
And there's one other expense that we haven't talked about, which is interest on loans. We have kids who graduate from college, and they have this, it's not a new problem, it's just exacerbated. They have this huge debt that they're starting out in life with, and even before they graduate. Families who are never, ever going to burn their mortgages, this is just not healthy for any economy. We look across the ocean at Greece and Ireland, and yeah, they have serious problems. Our problems in some ways are more serious because the total amount is so much greater. We are the world's market. We are the world's banker, even though we also owe a lot of money. But between the things you mentioned and energy costs, which are also out of sight, we have some serious burdens that we're carrying around with us that make it hard for us to compete as a country. But nothing makes it more difficult to compete, in my view, than lack of education. And I remember when I was a kid that smart kids were made fun of, but they weren't pariahs. Today, people are proud of their ignorance. We've got to change that. We need smart people to help us solve some of these difficult problems.
Do you think it could be as much of a cultural thing that could get us out of this depression, recession than anything else?
Maybe so. And so maybe what we're really lacking is leadership, huh? We don't have political leaders who are actually leading us anywhere.
Yeah,
There's
confidence, and we've been somewhat demoralized because we see like all these people who keep failing being rewarded, like Jamie Dimon and people like that. And,
there's an old story about I think in the 19th century, a French politician who was sitting at a sidewalk cafe. Suddenly, a mob of people go running down the street, and he jumps up out of his seat and he says, "I must go find out where my people are running to so that I can lead them there." And that's, I think, what we're getting from politicians. They read the polls, they find out what people want, and then suddenly that becomes what they want. Well, how about some fresh ideas? How about not making everything about your career? How about helping the rest of us for a change, serving the people who elected you? That's what I'd like to see.
And letting special interests know that they can't get everything they want because they're offering some money or perks.
Right.
Now here's another thing: industrial hemp. Might not solve the whole economy, but it might not hurt. It might help. Do you think?
Well, it's a locally grown natural product, something that going back as far as Thomas Jefferson thought was a great idea. But again, we have a fair amount of education to deal with. A lot of people think that industrial hemp is the same thing as smokable marijuana. Yes. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with smokable marijuana, but they're not the same product. And of course we ought to be using hemp for clothing and for all kinds of other things.
Yeah, ethanol, plastics,
right. I mean, a great source of fuel. Absolutely.
Even some infrastructure type things like panels for houses and stuff can be made.
But researchers aren't even allowed to experiment with it. Well, that's ridiculous.
That is.
We're handcuffing ourselves. It's nuts.
We import $400 million of hemp, at least recently, and they'll probably grow until we're able to, farm it ourselves.
You say we're importing it?
We're importing.
We should be exporting hemp. We should be producing it and sending it overseas.
Absolutely, and it's a good seasonal crop too. So when they have nothing else to grow, they can grow this in the middle between crop rotations. And
by the way, I don't want to minimize the danger of addictive drugs, and there are a lot of people who are in hospitals today because they have a drug addiction. But the biggest, most serious drug addiction that we face is addiction to tobacco. Approximately 1 in 10 people in hospitals today are there because of a smoking-related illness.
Prescription drugs, too.
And prescription drugs are a very serious problem.
People can try those electronic cigarettes. One of my friends tried one of those, and that seemed to help a lot. But I don't know what's inside those, so I'm not recommending it.
But we have to get over the notion that morality is the most important question in setting public policy. Public policy is the most important question. What's in the best interest of most people?
And you can make an argument that aren't they kind of the same thing? It's just how you define what morality really is.
Sure. Well, I think morality should focus on people's quality of life. I think we ought to worry about how we're going to serve most people, how we're going to prevent people from dying unnecessarily, from being victims of unnecessary violence. And a lot of it does come back to the economy, too. In the worst of times, people are desperate, and they do desperate things.
So how come you ran as an independent, even though you have the top two takes all in California in your primary systems?
Mm-hmm.
You could have, you could have run as a Republican or Democrat. How come you ran as an independent, sir?
Well, first of all, because I am an independent. As a journalist, I thought it was appropriate for me not to be a member of a party when I was covering politics. But beyond that, as much as I respect people who belong to political parties, and to the parties themselves, they're not all bad, but they shouldn't be in charge of our electoral system. The parties decide who get to vote, and then who gets to run. This is not okay with me. You should be free to vote for whomever you wish. No party should tell you that you can only vote for someone in one party or another. That's just not democratic in my view. And of course, the worst of it is that we have this corrupted system of patronage that's far worse than anything that Chicago has been accused of doing. We've reached the point now where I think you can pretty closely predict how a member of Congress is going to vote based on the people who contributed to his political campaign, based on the corporate money that makes it possible for him or her to run. That's just not okay with me. So that's why I'm running as an independent.
Yeah, and also, that we need. That's a way to send a message too. I mean, if you just ran as a Republican and a Democrat, and we're going to still promote the same ideas that you've just talked about, you might not get as much attention. But if there's a wave of people, who are in the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, and just your average persons, or not so average, who say, you know what, I think this year I'm going to research the candidates and see if there's someone else that is not a Republican or Democrat that I would still feel good about voting, and maybe that will get reported on the media that on November 7th we had we turn over somewhat the beginnings of a new leaf, and so it just kind of challenges the paradigm. It creates new neural nets. It lets people show the possibilities, because if they see that's possible, it kind of breaks in a little bit of light that there might be other possibilities, like, hey, maybe we won't spend so much time and resources on this drug war, which also violates, it's used as an excuse to violate a lot of your civil liberties, just like the term terrorists. We should go after terrorists, but they create a special court for that, like a military tribunal. They've done the same things with the drug laws. Those are two laws that's our war against American people. They weren't declared, and just opening that aspect of showing the possibilities, it might not be an end-all, be-all in itself, but it can be the beginning to getting the ball rolling.
Thomas, you were asking me about partisan politics. I want to quibble with something you said at the beginning of this conversation, which is that you said this district where I'm running is a largely Republican district. In fact, about 48% of the registered voters are registered as Republicans. Well, the way I was taught arithmetic in school, that's not a majority. That's a minority. The Democrats have a smaller minority. They're about 30%. And then the small parties, together with those who, like me, who are not members of any political party, also have about 25 or 30%. But if you combine the Democrats, the Republicans who are unhappy with my opponent, and people like me who are not a member of either of those parties, if you combine all of us together, we actually are in the majority. And I think the reason I'm going to win is because most people, like me, most people are fed up with what we have. And they want something better. They want something different for sure. And I think that if I'm able to tell my story to enough people, I don't think it's going to be difficult for me to beat this guy.
Well, are you willing to debate Kevin, or
The day after the primary election, I called his Washington office to congratulate him for surviving the primary along with me, and to invite him to a debate, to a series of debates. And the newspaper picked up on this, and one of the local TV stations also did. There's a website page, I think it's on Facebook, Accept the Challenge, Congressman McCarthy, something like that. And the initial reaction, of course, was silence. And then they put him on the local TV news on a week ago Friday, I think it was. And after pressing him over and over again, he finally said, well, I guess a debate would be no problem. But, of course, he also said he wanted to wait to get closer to the election to give himself some wiggle room and maybe a possible out. But we're not going to let him.
Would you be willing to do maybe 3 or 4 debates?
I think we should do at least half a dozen debates. This is a huge district. It's about 10,000 square miles. It covers 3 counties. We have more than 800,000 people living here. People need to be able to see this guy up close. He's never here. Of course, he spends his time in Washington, but even when Congress isn't in session, he travels around the country recruiting and promoting other politicians. We want to see him in the district. People are asking, where's Kevin? How come he's never here?
I mean, isn't that an issue in itself? Because, you could almost say, besides the NDAA, which I think is my own personal litmus test, is that you can either vote for someone who's willing to debate you or not, until he does. I think it's very, if he doesn't do the debates, but I guess that's still yet to be determined. There is 4 more months remaining, but 6 of them sounds good.
One local group has invited me to debate. There have been, I guess, 3 groups so far who have offered to host a debate, each of them. And one of them said that they'll have the debate whether Kevin shows up or not. And that's fine with me. I would rather not debate an empty chair, frankly. I'd like to look at him in the eye and ask him why it is that in 6 years in office, in Congress, why is it that he's only authored one bill that became law? And that bill was to rename a post office. This is not what I would consider a stellar, not a stellar legislative record. But that's okay. I'm sure that he'll have some answer. I would just like to hear it from him and not by email or from some surrogate. He needs to stand up and explain why his failed leadership has led to the poor results that we've had in the last 6 years. I'm in the fortunate position, I'm sad to say this, but I'm in the fortunate position of being able to ask the Ronald Reagan question to my fellow residents here. Are you better off than you were before you elected this guy? And the value of their houses has crashed, and unemployment's gone through the roof, and the number of people who graduate from college and even from high school has plummeted. This guy's been a disaster for the district. He's been great for his own career. He's been great for the big oil companies, the big tobacco companies, the big insurance companies. That's fine. But what about the rest of us? We didn't send him to Congress to be a leader of his party. If he wants to get a job with the RNC, he should apply to that organization. If he wants to represent his district, he should change his policies.
Well, there you go, and that sounds like a challenge to me. And after all, it's, we can agree and disagree on certain things, but one thing I can agree on is that, it's good to engage people, and this kind of goes in a string of foreign policy as well. It's good to engage people, learn from them, talk to them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they say, but and that kind of thing helps strengthen us all. And now Terry Phillips for Congress, that's P.O. Box 12492, Bakersfield, California 93389. Is that correct, sir? Or?
That's correct, and the website is phillipsforcongress.com.
All right, and then also there is a phillipsforcongress.com, and then there also is terryphillips.org. Is that correct? Or?
That's the email address. At the moment, they're both landing in the same spot, but okay. phillipsforcongress.com is the official website.
Excellent. And now, one thing I'd like to ask you is just two more things here. Is who your favorite past president or politician is, if you have one, sir?
I'm a big fan of Teddy Roosevelt. I think he was about as close to a perfect president as we have had. He was inspiring as an individual. His policies were tremendous. Of course, he helped to create the National Park Service, National Park System that we have. Really cared about this country. Was vigorous despite his physical challenges. He was extremely nearsighted, and there's a story that I learned in high school about him charging up what was supposed to be San Juan Hill and turned out to be another hill. But anyway, as he was riding his horse up this mountain, because he was so nearsighted, TR always carried spare eyeglasses with him, and if he had fallen off his horse, he probably would have been injured from all the breaking glass. I don't know if that's a true story or not, but it's emblematic of what a dynamic guy he was. When he became president, he was off on safari somewhere around the world. He was inspiring physically, personally, and politically. I think very highly of him.
Yeah, he after he was president, he went on a safari. He kind of he was kind of a timid kid and built himself up. And and he also, won as a Republican twice, and then later joined the Bull Moose Party
right.
against Woodrow Wilson and Taft. And he almost won that. That was, he probably had gotten one of the highest percentages of a third party. That was probably the last time we had that high of a percentage, except maybe Ross Perot.
But he gave the rest of us a lot of hope that despite the fact the odds seem to be against you, it doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying. And that's maybe the most important thing that he taught me was never, ever, ever give up, ever.
Yeah, he's the type of person that would, have some quotes that says, looking at my quotes here, no man is justified in doing evil on the ground of expedience. There's no room in this country for hyphenated Americans. No people is wholly civilized where the distinction is drawn between stealing an office and stealing a purse, and many more. And that's not the type of quotes I've been hearing, not the type of wit, you know, I've been seeing, you know, among the teleprompter, you know, gatherings that we have in Congress.
Yeah.
And it's not just Obama, it's all of them. I mean, you know, they don't have too many original ideas, it seems like. Now, I guess we'll just leave it. And Terry, I do appreciate your time today on this 4th of July. And is there a vision that you would like to share and some closing thoughts today with our interview before we close here today, sir, and wish you a great holiday.
Thank you, and the same to you, and particularly on our country's birthday. I think it's important that we remember that we do those things best when we do them together. That's how this country got started. We had a lot of differences. We still have a lot of differences. But there's no excuse for us to treat each other as the enemy. We are not the enemy. There is no us and them. There's just us. And we need to start acting that way again. We need to stop this bickering in Washington. We need to keep our eye on the ball and recognize that we can still do great things. This is still the #1 destination in the world. But we need to start behaving that way again inside as well. And I just cannot tell you how delighted I am to be able to talk about this with you today. And thanks again very much for the invitation, Thomas.
Well, it was my pleasure, and that's why we're called libertarianprogressive.com. That's a central theme here. I might not agree with all libertarian policies or all you know, progressive policies, but to me that there is a common set of main ingredients there that you need to, you know, to keep this pot stewing, per se, I guess, and keep this engine cranking towards the 21st century. Now, thank you so much. I'll say goodbye to you off the air, and please, people, take a look at Terry Phillips. What's that website again, one more time, sir?
It is phillipsforcongress.com, Phillips with 2 L's.
Great. 23rd District, California, U.S. House of Representatives, 2012, sir. And I'll say goodbye to you after we close here. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Thomas.